Well, if I don't see you tonight or Wednesday, I'm hoping I will. But if I don't, I hope you have a wonderful Christmas, a wonderful week, and we will look forward to seeing you on Sunday morning, next Sunday morning. This morning, I'm going to start our sermon with a little bit of a riddle. Because we're going to be talking about something that almost everybody has in their house, but that nobody really likes. And we're going to be talking about something that always tells you the truth, but almost everybody thinks it's lying or it's broken. So I guess the riddle would go something like this. What is it that everybody has in their house, but nobody likes, that always tells them the truth, but everyone thinks it's lying? Do you have an answer? Do you need some more time? We're going to be talking about this. The household scale, right? It tells you the truth every time, but it must be broken. Must be lying. Almost everyone has one, but nobody really likes it. And it's going to be kind of our way of introducing our story and our application as we go back to the story in Daniel chapter 5 about the handwriting on the wall. If you want to begin turning to Daniel chapter 5, we're going to talk about this. I've entitled the story, How Often Do You Weigh Yourself? A lot of times we get on that scale and we don't like that number that pops up, and so we are reluctant to weigh ourselves very often. What does a household scale have to do with Daniel chapter 5? Well, these stories in the Old Testament, a lot of them like Daniel, sometimes are stories that we've learned when we went to Bible class as a kid, right? And kids kind of like those stories. Man, a hand pops up and starts writing on the wall. That's kind of exciting. But sometimes we think of these stories as only kind of children's Bible class stories. But they have an incredible value to us. And they are written to us as adults. So let me ask you, how often do you weigh yourself? Again, you might be asking, well, what does that have to do with this story in Daniel chapter 5? Well, let's go to Daniel chapter 5 and begin reading in verse 1. We'll read not through all of it, but the first few verses here. Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. That's a huge drinking party. The king and 1,000 of his nobles. Verse 2. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, his concubines, might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives, his concubines, drank from them. You get the picture? It's not enough to have this drunken wine party, but now we're using God's vessels. It gets worse. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, the gods of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So I want you to get the picture of this drinking party, and they're just having a good time. It's a religious feast dedicated to the gods of gold and silver and wood and stone and iron. But it's a good time. Nothing to worry about. The cares of the world are gone. We're just having a good time. And then all of a sudden, verse 5, everything changes. The music stops. The celebrating comes to an eerie silence. Screams can be heard in the room when suddenly the fingers of a man's hand emerge and begin writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. The king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. The king called aloud to bring the conjurers, the Chaldeans, the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. The king Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. So, as we begin to look at this story, it will help us a little bit to know a little bit about the main character here, Belshazzar, the king. Now, in the verses we just read, it talks about Nebuchadnezzar being his father, but most believe that it really is his grandfather. Nebuchadnezzar was his grandfather, and that Belshazzar, as best we can tell, reigned about 550 years before the time of Christ, about 553 to 539 BC. Now, we haven't gotten to it, but if you're familiar with the story, you know the story takes place in 539 BC, if that's correct dating of his reign. And it not only takes place in 539 BC, it takes place on the very last day of his reign as king. Now, I don't know what day of 539 that is, but it's the day that he is taken off the throne, so to speak. We also come to believe that he is what we call co-regent, that he's reigning with his father. 3 times in this chapter, we read one of them where he's talking about the man who can come and read this inscription and give its interpretation, what will have purple and gold and will be what? Not the second ruler. Look at verse 7 when he says, and he'll have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as a third ruler in the kingdom. Now, when Joseph was promoted by Pharaoh, he was the second in command. He was second ruler. When Herod watched Herodias' daughter dance, he said, I will give you up to half the kingdom. But here, he says he will be a third ruler. And it is believed that this is evidence that the father is the king. He is a co-regent, a co-king with his father. And so the only position would be the third in rulership. But more importantly, as you look at this, Belshazzar has a reputation of what you see right here. Some of the words that have been used to describe the king are these: spoiled, selfish, decadent, apathetic. One put it this way: he is a weak king of a very strong nation. But not for very long. You might remember back in Daniel 2 that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of this magnificent statue. And Daniel comes in and interprets that the head of gold that he saw in this dream is Babylon. But then as you work down the statue, he says, then there was the breast of silver, which represent a weaker nation that was going to take over the head of gold. How did that happen? How does a weaker nation come and take over a stronger nation? Well, I really believe that as we look at Belshazzar, another way that he is described as a weak ruler is that, well, he kind of took things for granted. He kind of just became overconfident in the strong, mighty army that they had. The well-trained soldiers. The victories that they had won. The large fortified cities. He just took it for granted. And so he let his guard down. And so on this night, which is going to be his last as king, the Medo-Persian army is coming and surrounding the area. And what is he doing? He's not concerned with it. He doesn't even know it's happening. He's drinking with his 1,000 nobles, praising the gods of gold and silver, iron, wood, and stone, those gods who aren't able to tell him what's about to happen. Those gods who are not able to warn him. And so Belshazzar just takes his strength, the strength of his nation, for granted. He lets his guard down. And we're going to read what happens at the end. But it kind of reminds me of one of the great childhood memories I have. One of the great childhood events. When I was 11 years old, watching the 1980 Olympic hockey team, the U.S. hockey team, take on Russia, the Soviet Union. And it's amazing to me how much we were against kind of that communist system today. And looking at what's happening in our world today, it just makes my head spin. But here was a game, and I kind of relived this recently by watching a documentary where they interview some of the U.S. players. They interview Coach Herb Brooks, who was alive at that time. They interview some of the Soviet players. And what you have here is a picture of the Soviet players. I actually think this is a picture of the movie Miracle. And this is the actual event on top here. But I like this picture because in this documentary, the Soviet players talked about how they became so overconfident. They just took their success for granted. They just knew they were going to win the gold medal because for the last 20 years they just dominated. They not only won, they crushed their opponent. They didn't know what it was like to lose. And so they thought they could just show up, a gold medal would be handed to them, and they could go home victors. They let their guard down. And so a group of college-age kids were able to work some 6 months before the Olympics. And they worked hard and they dedicated, they sacrificed everything. It was all about hockey, the Olympics. The Soviet Union had, in fact, beaten them something like 10-3, even right before the Olympics started. They were going to clobber these teenage kids. But it all went very, very differently. They were just like Belshazzar. they experienced a defeat they didn't know was coming. They were overconfident. They took things for granted. They let their guard down. And they were shocked. That's exactly what's going to happen to Belshazzar. But his gods can't tell him. But the one true God decides to tell him. Brothers and sisters, we need to be careful. I don't think any of us would look at Belshazzar and say, yeah, I'm just like him. I'm not stipulating that. But we can fall to that same trap, that same snare. Where we look at our house, we look at our cars, we look at our jobs, and we're just like, we got it made. And we put all our focus on that. And we let our guard down. And we lose our focus. And Jesus Christ doesn't come to be a priority or the priority. We have this holiday season, which is a perfect example how people just lose their focus. Well, people will flock to churches celebrating the birth of Christ, which is not commanded in the Bible, and forsake taking the Lord's Supper on the Lord's Day. We need to be careful. How many Bible passages are there that talk about standing firm, being alert, being sober? 1 Peter 5 talks about the devil, Satan, being a roaring lion. And so what do we have to do? We have to be alert. We have to be sober. We have to know and not let our guard down. And I think it's so interesting that you look at this in the book of Daniel. God twice in the history of his people emphasized and brought forth one of his own children and gave him the power to interpret dreams. Because those nations at that time put so much stock in dreams and dream interpretation to know what was going to happen in the future. Of course, so much of that was just all made up. It was all in their favor. So he brings Joseph to Egypt and he says, you want to know about dreams and what's going to happen in the future? I'll show you how it's done. And then you've got Daniel, and Daniel, just like Joseph, comes and he says, you put so much emphasis on dream and dream interpretation, but here's your wisest men, your conjurers, your magicians, your Chaldeans, and they can't tell you what any of it means. But here I bring one of your captives, one that you've conquered, one who doesn't worship your gods, but worships a God who just allowed his people to be overtaken. And I bring him and he interprets the dreams for you. And just as he says, it comes to be fruition. But Daniel 5, God doesn't use a dream. God, in the most unique way, in a book filled with dreams and dream interpretation. In fact, during the days of Belshazzar, there's been dreams from God, dreams that talk about the future. But those dreams came to Daniel, not to the king. And Daniel had to figure out and wanted to know, what does this mean? But it's not a dream that God uses in Daniel 5. It's this hand that shows up during this lavish drinking party, during this religious festival to the gods of gold and silver and iron and stone and wood. And this hand writes on this message on the wall. He took things for granted. So what are we going to do? The king's face is growing paler. He's alarmed. Here he has his most trusted, his most talented men, his counselors, his wise men, and I believe, the consensus, they could read the words. They're in Aramaic. But they're not words in a sentence. There's no context to it. They can't tell them what it means. So what are they going to do? Well, look, if you would, beginning at verse 10. Again, the consensus is this is not Belshazzar's wife, the queen. This is his queen mother. The queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the kings, his nobles. The queen spoke and said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face to be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians and conjurers and Chaldeans and diviners. This was because of the extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and the solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. That Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation." I find it interesting. You have King Belshazzar, who has no idea about Belteshazzar, Daniel. Two names so close together. So here comes the queen mother, who, a little bit older, who remembers days gone by and remembers Daniel. But I find it so interesting that here you have the king and Belshazzar, and you have kind of this deja vu moment, right? We've read about this in Nebuchadnezzar. There's this message from Jehovah, from Yahweh. But all the conjurers are called in, and they cannot interpret it. They cannot make their gods cannot tell them what this means. And so they're alarmed, they're puzzled. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar was going to kill all of the wise men until finally Daniel steps forward and saves the day. The God Most High gives Daniel the interpretation. But Daniel, those days are gone. Daniel's almost forgotten. Belshazzar doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know those days. He doesn't know what happened in the days of his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar until the queen mother comes and says, "Rest assured." And notice her certainty that Daniel will come and he will do this. Not that he can, maybe he will. He will do this. Us older ones love to talk about the back in my days. And why do we like to talk about back in my days? Because we always see them as the glory days, right? And there's not a generation that comes into existence that doesn't look at the younger generation and say, "You guys just don't get it." These days are not like those days. Those are better days. And there's not a generation that comes, a new generation, that doesn't look at the older generation and says, "You're out of touch, you don't get it, you don't understand." And you got this story going on here. Well, Belshazzar doesn't care about what happened in the past. He's living in the present. He has that power. He has that ability. He doesn't care about the future. It's all about here and now. I want to tell you, it's wrong on both sides. It's quite possible that 20 to 30 years have passed by since Daniel's glory days. It's clear that Belshazzar has no remembrance of that, has no idea, hasn't heard of it. It's wrong for the older generation to look at the younger generation and just lump them all together and just say, they don't get it. There's nothing good about it. They've got all these problems. It's not like it was in our day. It's just not right. It's not Christ-like. Our young generation has a lot to offer. A lot of good stuff. And we need to point that out to them. We need to embrace that. We need to use that enthusiasm and direct it towards God, instead of just discard them as young, inexperienced, immature. And that's done. It's done in churches. And it's wrong on the other side for a younger generation to look at the older generation and say, you're in our way. You don't get the technology. You don't get what we're all about today. You just are slow. Get out of my way. We got to remember passages like Leviticus 19:32. You shall rise up before the gray-headed and honor the aged, and you shall revere your God. I am the Lord. I think about that passage in 1 Timothy chapter 5, where Paul, by inspiration, talks about one who has a dependent but does not supply, does not provide for them. And Paul says that one is worse than an infidel. I think about where Jesus in Matthew 15 talked about that generation that came up with this loophole, that you didn't have to help mother and father. If you take the money that you have and you don't have to spend it on God, you just have to declare it raka. You just have to dedicate it to God. And mom and dad, in your old golden years, I wish I could help you. I wish I could support you, but this is raka. This is money for God, and I just got to hold on to this. There's lots of examples of it. I want to tell you something you already know. The memory of us is quickly fleeting. People aren't going to remember us. They're not going to remember what we do. How many of us spend time talking about, thinking about our great-great-grandfather or grandmother? Probably not even our great-grandmother, great-grandfather. They're forgotten. And we will be too. But there's a God who doesn't forget. A God that knows the very number of hairs on our head. A God that is so above and beyond us, and yet loves us enough that wants to have that personal relationship with us. He doesn't forget. In fact, He's preparing a place for us. So let's not put all of our glory days in the present or in the past, because the glory days for us are in the future. And they far exceed anything on the face of this earth. So as we look at this story, we got to call for Daniel. And so here comes Daniel, and you kind of have this deja vu, and Daniel comes in, and basically beginning in verse 18, he relates the story of chapter 4, which is all about Nebuchadnezzar and how God took him off the throne and made him live like an animal for a period of 7 years, 7 whatever. And because he didn't humble himself. He didn't give God the glory. And he comes to say to Belshazzar, guess what? You're just like him. But there was times in Nebuchadnezzar's life where he did praise God. He did give glory to the Most High God. Belshazzar was nothing like that. And so if you look down in verse 25, he finally gets to what is written on the wall. He says, now this is the inscription that was written out. Mene tekel upharsin. And it gives the interpretation. This is the interpretation of the message. Mina, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Notice the word scales. Notice the word weighed. That's where we started. But notice verse 28, Perez. Your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Great for Daniel! But it doesn't last very long. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. So what do these words mean? Here they are all together. The first word is repeated twice, and it could be that this word mina has kind of this double meaning. Maybe it's that double meaning coming out. It can mean to number something, right? How many people are here? Let's number them. 1, 2. But it also can be used in context of setting the number. Setting a number. And maybe that's kind of the thing that, number one, Belshazzar, your days have been numbered. God has numbered your days, and God has set the number of your days. And so that believes to be the first part of the message, that God says God has numbered Belshazzar's days. Let's look at tekel. Tekel, a word that means wanting or deficient. Wanting or deficient, right? You go through the drive-thru. You order, you get the bag, you take it, you just, they're on top of it, they're going to get it right. You go all the way home, you open up your order, and they left out the French fries. It's deficient. It's not what you ordered. It's less than what you paid for. And then, interestingly, on the wall is the word upharsin. Upharsin seems to be connected with the name of that nation, Persia. But notice in verse 28, he uses the word Perez, which also seems very close to Persia, but it has a meaning of divided. And that's exactly what he says. Your kingdom has been divided and will be divided between the Medes and the Persians. And so here, the gods of the gold and silver, the gods of iron, stone, and they cannot communicate anything to Belshazzar about what's coming, what has happened, because they're not real gods. So what's the message? It seems to be this: that the true God of heaven, Yahweh, lets him know, Belshazzar, you've been weighed out by God, but found deficient of moral worth or godly leadership. And so God is going to remove you. So here's our question. Does God weigh us? Yeah, he does. But to help that, he expects us to weigh ourselves. So let me ask you, when's the last time you took spiritual retrospection of yourself? When's the last time you weighed yourself, not on a physical scale, but on a spiritual scale? Is it something like that scale? I don't like what I see, so I'm kind of reluctant to get back on that. I'm reluctant to look at it. I'm reluctant to weigh myself. But the last time you did, how did you measure up? Did you use the right scales? Did you use the correct measuring rod? You know, God wants us to weigh ourselves. He wants us to take and do some inventory on us every day, to look at our attitude. One of the problems of Belshazzar is he had the wrong attitude. He had an attitude of arrogance. He thought he was strong. He took it for granted. He thought, hey, let's go use God's vessels. But what he failed to see is that he might have been king of Babylon, but there was a greater king of the world that he had to pay no attention to. Sometimes we get an attitude like that, and I want to tell you, we can get away with it in the world we live in because that's the way the world is. That's not the way God is. But who wants the rewards of the world? The Bible has a lot of passages. In fact, I have a sermon in my files about, do you need an attitude adjustment? When's the last time you weighed yourself? How did you measure up when it came to priorities? Are your priorities the same as God's? Well, most of the time, but sometimes I'm going to keep control. It's going to be what I want. Well, then you're going to come out deficient. You see, the Word of God helps us so that when we step on that scale, we like what we see. And if we don't, then it helps us to change. It helps us to know what we need to work on. How did we measure up when it came to desires? That's the problem with the religious world. It's the problem with me. Too often I want God to conform to my desires and not the other way around. And do you take things for granted? You see, if we take things for granted, then we probably are going to step on that scale and we're going to have the wrong attitude and we're going to have the wrong priorities and we're going to have the wrong desires. You see this handwriting on the wall. And it's kind of interesting. We have a cliche today pretty much like that. About reading the handwriting on the wall. Do you get it? Do you understand it? Yeah, it was to a king way back. On his final day. Finally revealing what was going to happen. But his encounter with Yahweh was too late. That information was too late to do anything about it. Well, one day you're going to understand what God has planned for your future. For a lot of people, it will be too late. But for you and I, we already know. Because we don't worship the gods of gold and silver and iron and stone and wood. We worship Yahweh. But we need to make sure we don't get lost in this world, its culture, its off focus. That we don't take things for granted. And so if the handwriting on the wall of your life is troubling you, if you're stepping on that scale and coming up deficient, let's do something about that. With the love of Jesus Christ, the grace of God, and our ability to sit with you and to help you, to study with you, to pray with you, to bring you into that right relationship with Christ. Let's make sure next time we step on that scale, We like that number. If we can help you with that, won't you come as together we stand and as we sing.